Hi, welcome to Mr. Dyer's Musings. I'm Mr. Dyer, and today we're going to talk about the Confederate Medical Service. As always, I like to thank my wife and family for their unending support, for my incredible students, for always keeping me on my toes. Thank you to my viewers, my subscribers, and thank you for checking out my channel, checking out this video. Hopefully you learned something from it. And if you like the video, please click like, please subscribe to my channel, and check out all the other videos that I have on my channel as well. Right now, there's a plethora of various videos that focuses on Civil War medicine and Civil War officers, including a lot of different artifacts. All right, so let's talk about the Civil War Confederate Medical Service, MS. Now, the quick and dirty answer to the question that I got from a subscriber about how did the triage or how did the medical system compare for the Confederates as a Union? Well, for the most part, the Confederate Medical Service mimicked that of the Union Medical Service. But leaving that as is just wouldn't do justice to the Confederate medical departments and everything that they did to adapt to a very difficult situation. We're going to start from the beginning, talking about the Confederate Surgeon General, Samuel Preston Moore. Now, Samuel Preston Moore, he was a Union medical officer before the Confederates decided to secede from the Union. South Carolina seceded from the Union. When that happened in 1861, Surgeon General Moore, who was not Surgeon General at the time, resigned his commission. And he served in the medical department of the Union Army. And he has a history. He's been a long time military service. He served in the Mexican-American War up to the point of his resignation. He was born in South Carolina. Those of you who don't know, South Carolina is considered like the hotbed or the birthplace of secession. Like there were more people that died from South Carolina. They say South Carolina gave more to the Confederate cause than any other Confederate state because their population was literally completely decimated. But anyhow, I digress. So Surgeon General Moore, he was a South Carolinian. When he resigned his commission in the Union Army, he actually went back to Arkansas to resume his practice, his personal practice. And then he was approached by none other than the Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who also served in the Mexican-American War. He asked him personally to be the Surgeon General for the Confederate States. And Preston agreed. He signed on to be the Surgeon General of the Confederate Army, and he actually served from the beginning of the war to the end of the war, 1861 to 1865. So he had a long service. He was one of 24 military surgeons to resign their commission in the Union Army to serve on the Confederate side. There wasn't a lot of Union surgeons at the beginning of the war in the Union Army, and to have 24 of them leave, the majority stayed in the Union, but to have 24 of them leave to build the Confederate Medical Service is saying a lot. And Surgeon General Moore is actually going to build the Confederate Medical Service from the top down. He's going to use all those who served in the Union Army as kind of the basis, the platform to build the rest of the Confederate military service. And he is quite literally just going to take pages from the Union manuals and build it up. However, they're going to have some different difficulties that the Union Army didn't have. Surgeon General Moore was a meticulous organizer. I compare him, or at least I like to compare him, to General McClellan, who in my last few videos I talked about General McClellan, how I give him credit for being such a meticulous organizer. And also Jonathan Letterman. Jonathan Letterman, especially with his organization of General Orders 147, he paid attention to the detail. And Surgeon General Moore is going to be in the same frame of mind. That's how he's going to operate as well. He's going to be a very strict militarian. He's had a long service in the Army, and everything that comes across his desk needs to be in tip-top military shape. Otherwise, there's going to be repercussions. In fact, in my research, I found that Surgeon General Moore actually had charges brought up against an entire medical board, an examining board in the Confederate Army, because they weren't applying themselves in a military way. They weren't doing everything up to par, and he had them charged. And there was an examining board that went against them to make sure that they were legitimate. And that's saying something, because the examining board were supposed to be top of the line surgeons that are going through and making sure that those surgeons who are going to sign up in the military and serve as a military surgeon are up to snuff. He's going to expect military bearing on military correspondence. He's not going to do well with favoritism in the Confederate Army. If you are a surgeon, it's not because you just knew someone. It's because you knew your stuff. Like, you're going to be an excellent example of a military surgeon. And you're going to fill out all the forms right. You're going to dot the I's, cross the T's, etc. He's going to be a stickler for it. In the Confederate Army, these are some totals for you to kind of get your mind around the idea of what the Confederate Army's medical service looked like. There were 864 total surgeons that served. There were 1,668 assistant surgeons that served, and for a total of 2,502. This does not include the contract surgeons, and I'll come back to contract surgeons. The Navy, there were 22 surgeons, and there were 41 past assistant surgeons and 10 assistant surgeons. The ranking actually was a little bit different in the Navy. In the order, it was assistant surgeon, past assistant surgeon, and then you had surgeon. So when I say past, I mean P-A-S-S-E-D, not P-A-S-T. All right, so the medical service was modeled after the pre-war U.S. Medical Service. General hospitals in large cities are going to be the centers where all the wounded are eventually going to go. If you had an amputation, if you are sick really bad and you can't go on campaign, etc., you're going to end up going to a general hospital, generally speaking. They're going to be in buildings that are not suited for hospitals. The Confederate Army was not prepared at the beginning of the war to go into war. The surgeons knew at that time that airflow was extremely important. We didn't exactly understand germ theory, but we understood that space was extremely important to make sure that sickness at least had a chance of not spreading. And they're going to use old buildings, and they're just going to pack in the wounded as much as possible into these tight spaces. And sickness, disease, etc. is going to explode because of it. It was not until about 1863 that things are going to change. The Confederate Army has finally had enough time to build appropriate hospitals and handle the sick and wounded appropriately, just like their peers on the Union side. The largest hospital by the end of the war is going to be in Richmond. It's going to have 8,000 beds. That is huge. It's going to be a pavilion-style hospital. It's not going to be in some rundown warehouse. It's not going to be a tent city. It's going to be large, expansive pavilion hospitals. So how the triage kind of worked, I alluded to it. From the line of battle, you're going to have what's in medical service is going to be called the Infirmary Service. They're going to be men who's going to remove the wounded to a field hospital, and from a field hospital they're going to move to a general hospital. And that is a quick rendition of how things are going to go. In the Confederacy, the important transportation method that they're going to use are the rail lines. The rail lines are actually going to be the lifeblood of the Confederacy. That's why General William Tecumseh Sherman, when it's marched down to the sea, made it so personal to try to destroy all rail lines as possible. He's not even going to worry about the Union reusing those rail lines. If they destroy them completely, then the Confederacy is not going to be able to move the supplies and wounded as necessary. The Confederate rail lines in the South, below the Mason-Dixon line, were actually of a different gauge. So the gauge is the width of the rails, and there's going to be difference in the South compared to the North. And like I said, the rail lines is going to lead to the transportation of the wounded, of supplies, and of men all across the South. The waterways were actually a little bit more dangerous for the Confederacy to use. They certainly did when they could, but due to the Union Army's restriction on the waterways, it's going to be very dangerous. So the Confederacy is going to use land service a lot more than waterways. More established what's called way hospitals. And this is something that's very unique to the Confederate Army. From all my research and readings on the Union side, way hospitals was not something that was exactly used. I think this has to do with how expansive and stretched out the Confederate Army was. Way hospitals were basically centers that had medical supplies, they had doctors, they had beds, they had rations or food, so that the sick and wounded could actually have a place to stay on their way back home to either convalesce and return back to their units, or if they were mustered out of service, they would go there before heading home for good. So way hospitals were something that's pretty unique. Now let's get to why the Confederate Medical Service kind of had struggles. The Union Army, certainly they had to play a little bit of catch up because their standing army before the beginning of the war was actually pretty small. And then they grew when Lincoln called for 75,000 troops to defend Washington, D.C. It grew exponentially. Well, the Confederacy didn't have the framework in place to deal with all the wounded and sick that the Confederacy was going to see. And remember that during the American Civil War, it was disease and sickness that killed more men than battles or wounds from the battles. Sickness is going to be the one thing that's going to kill the majority. At the beginning of the war, in 1861, there's going to be what's called the Anaconda Plan. The idea behind the Anaconda Plan is we're going to constrict the Confederacy. We're going to blockade them. We're going to not allow the movement of supplies from Europe into the Confederacy or other resources. And this was going to slowly bring the Confederacy to its knees. And the Anaconda Plan was certainly used throughout the entirety of the war. The problem is more like a siege warfare kind of concept. It's a first step. And the Anaconda Plan did a great job of limiting those supplies, limiting arms and ammunition, medicines, and food to get to the Confederacy. But this is going to be a very, very slow, like I said, siege mentality process, especially when Vicksburg falls and you have the Mississippi River, which was being kept by the Confederate on the southern side. When Vicksburg fell, then that pretty much split the Confederacy east and west, and it was very difficult for the Confederacy to recover after that. That main water line that assisted moving supplies from the Gulf of Mexico to the rest of the South was destroyed. So this Anaconda Plan, the blockade, is going to slowly strangle the Confederacy. It's going to make those medical supplies very difficult to get. And I found a book that was actually put out by the Confederacy in 1863 to assist doctors. Because medical supplies was so hard to get, they had to come up with alternative means to make sure that the men and the doctors could get equitable medicines. And the book is called Resources of the Southern Fields and Forests, Medical, Economical, and Agricultural. And this is printed out in Richmond in 1863, and it was written by F.P. Porcher. And the book basically was a field guide. It was used as an issue to the doctors, so they could go out to the forests and the fields, and they could use these herbal remedies to make up for the lack of commercial medical supplies. Agents were sent to Europe to buy medical supplies for the Confederacy, but transporting them, running them through the blockade was the difficult part. And this is something that the Confederacy had some benefits of compared to the Union Army. The Union Army ran into a lot of red tape. And that red tape was because early on in the war, the government didn't want to, and I say government, but the acting medical Surgeon General at the time before Hammond, he was very conservative about what supplies and what money got sent to the front. If you damaged a pannier, for example, you had to account for everything, and you better account for everything if you want to be resupplied. When Hammond got the position of Surgeon General and Letterman came on in the Army of the Potomac as the medical director, that whole mindset actually flipped. It's one of the reasons why the wounded and sick early on in the war didn't get the necessary medical attention that they should have gotten, that red tape. The focus was definitely on the war, putting the men in uniforms, getting them guns, etc., ammunition to fight. It was not on the sick and wounded. When Surgeon General Hammond came on and Letterman came on, that red tape was cut, and there was a free flow of medical supplies and resources to the Union Army. Now, certainly they still had the infrastructure problems of quartermaster's department, etc., getting those medical supplies to the front, but it was more readily available, and the money was there to assist the Union side. The Confederacy never ran into that red tape. Richmond, well, Alabama at first, but basically the Confederate capital was very supportive of the medical service. So getting that money and getting those supplies, if they were to be had, was not the problem. It was as the blockade started circling that those medical supplies became difficult to get. So triage in the Confederacy, like I said at the beginning, is going to mimic that of pre-war Union Army. It's not going to mimic the Army of the Potomac. From the battle line, you're not going to have soldiers who are going to just drop their guns or put their guns on their back and start taking their comrades to the field hospitals. Instead, you're going to have what's called the Infirmary Service. And the Infirmary Service are going to be the slackers and the bandsmen who are going to get that job to remove the wounded from the line of battle to the ambulance, to the dressing, or to the field hospital, and then later on to the general hospitals. And the problem with using slackers and bandsmen, they just don't care. And they're also not trained appropriately to take the wounded to the field hospitals. Fighting men, especially later on in the war, were just too valuable to take from the front lines and use them in the infirmary service to move those wounded to the field hospitals. Towards the end of the war, they're even going to use slaves. They're going to use aged men and teenagers, young men who were old enough or big enough to carry wounded, even on carts, versus the young men who were able to carry a rifle and be on the front line. There's going to be an invalid corps that's going to be established later on in the war, and the invalid corps were basically men who might have served in the Confederate Army and were still able to move around. They may not have been completely fit to be on the front line, maybe they lost an eye or something, but they still have the ability to carry wounded on a stretcher and put them in an ambulance and take them where they need to go. Unlike the Army of the Potomac under Letterman's plan, where the ambulance corps is going to be molded into its own entity, separate from the quartermaster's department. The quartermaster's department in the Confederacy is actually going to maintain control over the ambulances. So this is going to be the same problem that the Union Army ran into, where you had officers that are going to use ambulances for baggage. You're also going to have issues where officers are going to get priority treatment. This is actually going to be addressed in a general order I'm going to read you towards the end of this video. The quartermaster department is going to be responsible for getting the horses, having the forge and the blacksmith to repair whatever is needed, and a saddler, someone who is capable in leather work to make sure that the harnesses are in tip-top shape and that those are appropriate. The quartermaster's department is going to maintain that control. This often led to the sick and wounded being a secondary concern. They're not going to get out of that mindset where the sick and wounded should have their own priority and their own methods of getting to the field hospitals for their services. Okay, so let's talk about general orders. So in general orders, number 53, Headquarters Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, Charlotte, South Carolina, April 5th, 1863. And I'll actually cite this below in the description. So if you want to check it out yourself, more than welcome to. I'm going to skip a few of the lines. And I'm just going to address those that pertain to the medical service. Section 4. Soldiers must not be permitted to quit the ranks to strip or rob the dead, nor even to assist in removing our dead unless by special permission, which shall only be given when the action has been decided. The surest way to protect our wounded is to drive the enemy from the field. The most pressing, highest duty is to win the victory. Before the battle, the quartermaster of the division will make all the necessary arrangements for the immediate transportation of the wounded from the field. After consulting with the medical officers, he will establish the ambulance depot in the rear and give his assistants the necessary instructions for the efficient service of the ambulance wagons and other means of transportation. The ambulance depot to which the wounded are to be conveyed or directed for immediate treatment should be established at the most convenient building nearest the field of battle. A red flag marks the place and way to it. Before and immediately after the battle, the roll of each company will be called. The absentees must strictly account for their absence from the ranks. To quit their standard on the field under fire, under the pretense of removing or aiding the wounded, will not be permitted. Anyone persisting in it will be shot on the spot, and whoever shall be found to have quit the field or his regiment or company without authority will be regarded and proclaimed as a coward and dealt with accordingly. So right here, very clearly you can see there's someone, their next buddy were to get shot, wounded, or whatever. He wasn't able to drop his rifle and pick up that wounded to take him to the dressing station or take him to the closest ambulance. Otherwise, he'd be shot on the spot. This was a problem that even plagued the Union Army early on, which is why the ambulance corps was established. It made it very clear, and it also told the other soldiers, like, hey, you do your job, and these guys will take care of the wounded. Your buddy's not going to just be left behind. However, when we talk about quality, unless they're trained in those efforts, then the quality is not there. The active ambulances will follow the troops to succor the wounded and to remove them to the depots. Before the engagement, infirmary detachments will also be detailed and organized of 3, the least effective under arms, the slackers, from each company, whose duties will be hereinafter prescribed. These men must not loiter about the depots, but will return promptly to the field as soon as possible. The infirmary detachments will be under the immediate orders of the medical officers on the field. This corps will go upon the field unarmed except the non-commissioned officers, who are to protect the corps against stragglers and marauders. So if you're an ambulance corpsman, unlike the Union Army, where the Union Army was under arms, you carried a revolver, etc. In the Confederate Army, the ambulance corpsmen were not to carry arms. And I wonder if this has to do with the lack of training. This is before Geneva Convention and some other things that came on later on in the world history. The Union Army were permitted to carry the revolver for basically 3 purposes: to protect the ambulances that were under their care. So unlike the Confederacy and the Union Ambulance Corps, you were responsible for your ambulance. You were responsible for the water kegs, the alcohol that was on them, and we had drug addicts and we had alcoholics back then, just like we do today. So there's that, to make sure that people aren't going to use the ambulances for other means, like carrying baggage or your personal wagon to get from point A to point B. And to put down the horses in case you need to. And for your own protection and the protection of the wounded. So that'd be like 4 and 5. All right. So The members will be provided with 1 litter to every 2 men, and each with a badge by which he can be easily distinguished from the rest of the command. Also with leather shoulder straps, a canteen of water, a tin cup, a haversack containing 1/8 pound of lint, 4 bandages, 2 long and 2 short splints of wood, sponges, and tourniquets, and a pint bottle of alcoholic stimulant. Now, that's something that the Union Ambulance Corps didn't carry on them. That's something that wasn't expected of the Union Ambulance Corps to do. And I'm going to pause right there for really quick. Nowhere from my research and readings was there ever a mention of a dressing station in the Confederate Army. From reading this and other after battle reports, etc., I am led to believe that the ambulance depots, that first place where the men were removed from the line of battle to the ambulance depots, and from the ambulance they were moved to the field hospital, which is about a mile to a mile and a half away. So those ambulance depots, I think, acted as the dressing station comparatively to the Union Army. I find it odd that the Confederacy permitted non-medical personnel, especially people who weren't trained in using bandages or using tourniquets, etc., to carry those on their person in a haversack. So that's kind of interesting, something that's unique to the Confederate Army. It shall be the duty of this corps, under the immediate direction of the assistant surgeon of the regiment, accompanied by the ambulance or wagons, to follow up promptly the action, administering to the immediate wants of the wounded by giving stimulants, checking hemorrhage, and the temporary splinting of fractures. So right there, it addresses that lack of training. But it says that it shall be the duty of this corps under the immediate direction of the assistant surgeon of the regiment, accompanied by the ambulance wagons to follow up promptly the action, administering to the immediate wants. So even though that you're an ambulance corpsman and you're carrying these stretchers from the line of battle to the ambulance depots, and you have on your person, your haversack, these items. You have alcoholic stimulants, you have bandages, you have splints, and you have tourniquets. Until you get to the ambulance depot, you're not supposed to use those things that you carry on your person. The ambulance depot is supposed to act as the dressing station, if you will. Perhaps once you remove the wounded there, you are expected to be like a nurse. Not nurse in like our contemporary mindset of nursing, but you're expected to give the men water, make them somewhat comfortable, etc. And as the assistant surgeons are going around and pointing out who goes onto the ambulance first to go to the field hospital, perhaps then they will point out to a stretcher bearer or an infirmary serviceman and say, hey, give this person a swig of the stimulant. This person has a broken leg. Will you please take one of your splints and bind their leg? I mean, these are some things, especially in the military service, if you've ever broken your arm on farm work or whatever, splinting is not something that is going to be new per se. The application and proper use of a splint to make sure that it's padded and in the right place, it certainly requires some medical knowledge. But I suspect that that's why those members who were stretcher bearers, even though they weren't trained officially, even though it was not their regular job, carried those supplies on the haversack. But that's just conjecture. That's just me thinking out loud. If you have an idea, please put a comment. Maybe you have another source that you can help me identify some more information on that. All right, let's get back to general orders, since we kind of stopped there. Those who are too much disabled to walk will be removed to some ambulance depot previously agreed upon, where they will be left in charge of the surgeon of the regiment. The removal of the wounded from the field will devolve upon the infirmary corps, and all men straggling from the ranks under pretext of aiding his corps will be summarily dealt with to which end the medical officers in charge and the non-commissioned officers are especially required to report to the regimental commanders of the stragglers their names and the company to which they may belong. The assistant surgeon in charge of the infirmary corps should provide himself with a pocket case, ligatures, needles, pens, chloroform, napkins, brandy or whiskey, tourniquets, bandages, lint, and splints. To obviate the shock of the nervous system, to suppress hemorrhage, to put fractures in some temporary apparatus, so as to facilitate the removal of the wounded, should be his first care. This last is to be accomplished by placing under the fractured limb a piece of old linen or cotton of the form of a pocket handkerchief. On the opposite and outer edges of this are placed the splints, which are rolled up in it toward the lint on each side until the fracture is snugly supported in the intervening space, the whole to be secured by 2 or 3 bands of tape or bandage. The regimental surgeon should before an action satisfy himself by personal inspection that all the means and appliances for carrying the wounded are at hand. Give instructions to the infirmary corps as to the application of the tourniquet, to restrain dangerous hemorrhage, to establish depots for the wounded under the supervision of the medical director, and render to the men of his regiment all necessary surgical aid, performing there all operations that are required, and he will be held responsible that he has at his disposition all the means, supplies, and appliances for the proper performance of the service enjoined, or has taken all proper measures to secure them. He will instruct all detailed to assist him not to allow ambulances to be monopolized by wounded officers to the exclusion of others. He will forbid any of the infirmary corps to hold officers' horses on the field, or to do anything but what strictly appertains to their duty. The surgeon should not devote himself exclusively to a wounded officer, nor leave his post to accompany him to the rear. Wounds will be dressed and operations performed as far as practical on the field, and patients made as comfortable as circumstances will admit for transportation to hospitals in the interior. Surgeons will supply themselves with hospital flags and will have them attached to the ambulances and placed conspicuously over the field infirmaries and hospitals. As soon as possible after an action, surgeons will transmit to the medical director a return of casualties according to the following form. And the material for the badges and for ambulance flags prescribed in paragraph 6 of this order will be provided by the Quartermaster's Department by command of General Beauregard. Thomas Jordan, Chief of Staff. So there you go. So from towards the end there, you could see that right before battle, as far as tourniquets goes, surgeons are going to explain to the infirmary corps how to use those tourniquets. But this, it doesn't take a genius to understand how tourniquets are used, but if applied incorrectly, it's not going to stop the bleeding. You need to find where a major artery is, etc., to stop the bleeding. That's the whole purpose of a tourniquet. So I don't think I suspect that system didn't work quite as well as they had hoped. Now, that kind of breaks it down as far as the triage of the Confederate Medical Service. I could not find a lot of specific orders for the medical department of the Confederacy that address the ambulance corps, what they call the infirmary corps. But like I said, it was modeled after the Union Army. It would depend from army to army because the Confederacy is the Confederate States of America. You had independent bodies that, generally speaking, answered to Richmond towards the end of the war, that capital. But for the most part, armies were left to their own devices to address the challenges that are unique to them. Much like the Union Army, Jonathan Letterman devised General Orders 147, but it took until 1863 for the armies in the West, the Army of Tennessee, to accept, for the most part, Jonathan Letterman's plan. And that was, like I said, in 1863, after the Battle of Gettysburg, General Grant signed General Orders 53 and General Orders 22 in August of 1863. So there you have it. That kind of breaks down really quick about the Confederate Medical Service. There were a lot of issues for the Confederacy to get supplies. They had less surgeons than the Union Army as far as military surgeons because of the money. Surgeons were paid pretty well. Towards the end of the war, their pay was actually reduced to the rank of captain of cavalry. They relied on contract surgeons quite a bit. Now, those contract surgeons are going to be civilian surgeons who are going to serve in the Confederate military to help with the needs that they need. Anyhow, there you go. That's the quick and dirty of the Confederate Medical Service. I hope that answers my subscriber's question. If you have any other sources that you would like to share with me, please put it in the comments below. And if it's of use and has some detail, I'll even add it into the description so we can try to grow this understanding of what the Confederate Medical Service entailed, especially when it comes to the idea of triage, moving the men from the front of the line of battle to the general hospitals, and how that kind of looked in different circumstances. Thank you very much for watching this video. If it was of any use, if it helped you, if it educated you, if you're a little bit smarter because of it, if you found it interesting, please click like. And please subscribe to my channel. Help my channel grow, and that will help others find the channel, and it would increase our educational experience together. And like I said before, if you have something that you would like to say, or if you have a question, please put it in the comments below. This video came about because one of my subscribers actually asked the question, so I thought I'd address it. Thank you very much for taking the time with me this evening. I hope you had a wonderful time with me and you learned something. Give a kiss and hug to your loved ones. Have a wonderful day, and I will catch you later. Take care.